Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Today's book is all about Afghanistan. As one book reviewer put it, no one understands the successes and failures of American policy in Afghanistan better than Seth Jones. If you read just one book about the Taliban, terrorism, and the United States, this is the place to start. And that book is In the Graveyard of Empires, America's War in Afghanistan by author Seth G.Jones. Welcome to our show, Dr. Jones.
Thanks, Lois.
Your book begins by identifying why Afghanistan has earned its reputation as a graveyard of empires. You wrote that Afghanistan has been invaded by a multitude of great powers, including Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, only to be repelled with devastating effectiveness. Your book identifies and explains the logic, decision-making, errors in judgment, accomplishments, setbacks, and policy changes that have occurred since the United States was attacked in 2001 through the present. As we now know, the attacks in Washington, New York, and Pennsylvania on September 11, 2001 were planned in Afghanistan, and many of the hijackers went through training in Afghanistan. You have compiled and reviewed thousands of government documents from the U.S., Afghanistan, and coalition countries such as Germany and Britain, as well as interviewed Afghans and key U.S. policymakers. My question is, given that the U.S. is drawing down its forces by December 2014 and ending combat operations, what should U.S. policymakers expect to see in Afghanistan as American coalition troops depart?
Well, I think what American policymakers should expect depends on how many forces the Americans leave behind and what sorts of economic and financial assistance the U.S. and other countries continue. I think if you see a complete withdrawal of American forces and exit the way the Soviets exited Afghanistan in 1989, I think you're likely to see an increased probability of civil war.
Oh, really?
As a range of Pashtun, Uzbek, Tajik, and other actors vie for control of the capital, Kabul. Part of it also depends on what happens with the elections in 2014. President Karzai, who's really been in power since 2001,
Yes.
has agreed in principle to step down, and so in April or so we're expecting new elections.
Well, I think our viewers should know that you most recently served as an advisor and plans officer for the Commanding General, U.S. Special Operations in Afghanistan, and that you are currently a political scientist at the RAND Corporation in Washington. And so you know so much about this country and what has happened. So your feeling is it's still not quite clear if the war will spread as a result of the U.S. troop withdrawal. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the challenge we have with Afghanistan is this is not just a war that's going on inside of Afghanistan. The Afghan government's weakness historically means that its neighbors, whether it's the Russians now to the north,
Right.
The Pakistanis to the east, the Iranians to the west, the Indians, or other outside countries, including the British and the Americans, they all influence what's going on. And so this is not just about an Afghan government fighting against insurgents. This is against an Afghan government and its supporters fighting against insurgents who are backed by at least two major states, Iran and Pakistan.
Oh, my goodness. So do you expect the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan to be the greatest foreign policy challenge of the Obama administration?
Well, I think it'll be one of the most important ones, in part because this is where the largest number of U.S. forces has been under President Obama's watch. So the most is at stake. The largest number of American forces have died anywhere in the world in Afghanistan. So there is a tremendous amount at stake. There are obviously other countries of importance. The president's decisions on Syria are important. Relationship with China in North Africa and Egypt, those are all important. The Afghanistan one is, a lot rides on it because there are so many Americans that are there right now.
And what is it? Is it 57,000? Is that the number?
Yeah, and coming down to unclear right now, possibly 8,000 to 12,000 or so by December of 2014. Could be lower.
So they're gradually pulling them out.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
So that's all not going to be all done in 1 month.
That's right. From a peak of about 100,000 by 2011.
Interesting. Well, your book has a chronology of dated events that show how Afghanistan has evolved since the mid-1880s. And let's start with the first Anglo-Afghan War from 1839 to 1842. You wrote that the Afghans fought a British force of 16,000 troops which the Afghans reduced to one British soldier on a dying horse limping out of the country. I mean, 16,000 to one. It was shocking. Is that what happened?
Well, this is an amazing retreat. The British essentially lose all support within Afghanistan among the key tribes, among the government, and they exit out of the country in the middle of winter to Jalalabad. There is one remaining, is actually a doctor in the British Army who makes it back to the fort in Jalalabad. And he's on there's a famous painting, British painting, where he's on this wounded horse with the horse's tongue is drooping out.
And he's dying.
And he's dying, yeah. And the horse actually does die within 24 hours after he makes it. Now, there were other British soldiers and civilians that were taken prisoner that did survive, but one made it back on this march.
Okay, incredible. And then let's fast forward to Christmas Eve, 1979, and the Soviet Union forces invade Afghanistan. And by 1986, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev announces a partial withdrawal of Russian troops from Afghanistan. How much money and how many troops did the Russians lose in Afghanistan before the Soviet troops completely withdrew in 1989?
Probably the most important figure is the sheer number of Soviet forces that were killed. They lost about 15,000 American or Russian forces, compared to really only about 3,000 American over a much longer period of time. They lost millions, multiple millions of dollars in revenue. Hard to calculate it all. But what was interesting is a major reason that the Soviets ended up withdrawing is actually because of the number of Soviets that were dead. They didn't lose the fight per se. Mothers of Russian soldiers began to write letters to Gorbachev, and that was one factor that convinced him that he was losing support within, not Afghanistan, but he was losing support within the Soviet Union. So the loss of the counterinsurgency effort was less in Afghanistan as it was back in Moscow.
Now tell our viewers about the impact of Congressman Charlie Wilson's efforts to help freedom fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation in the late 1980s. You wrote that Congressman Wilson saw the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan as a chance to punish the Russians for Vietnam. How so?
Well, a couple of things. One is, for anybody that hasn't seen Charlie Wilson's War, it's sort of a Hollywood version of this, but still gets much of the story right. The issue for Charlie Wilson, and actually the CIA in general, which is the primary U.S. government arm that was funding the Mujahideen, the Soviets and the Chinese had backed the North Vietnamese. U.S. had lost a large number of American soldiers, had been defeated in Vietnam. So when the Soviet forces invaded in 1979, this was a chance by 1980, 81, 82 to support Mujahideen to kill Soviet soldiers. And it was a chance for Charlie Wilson, Congressman Wilson from Texas, to really, he was a strong, vehement, and vibrant anti-communist. And so he jumped at the chance to kill Soviet soldiers, which is what he did.
As your book describes, the United States deployed the military forces and civilians to Afghanistan after 9/11 to target al-Qaeda. How successful has the U.S. been in defeating al-Qaeda, you think?
Well, the U.S. has had some success. What al-Qaeda did after September 11th is the U.S. decimated the al-Qaeda leadership in Afghanistan. The remnants of it, including Osama bin Laden and his deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, traveled across the border into Pakistan. So for the next several years, there was a major effort to capture senior al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan. Another notable segment went to neighboring Iran and formed what bin Laden called the Management Council, and they were sort of a backup command and control node. Since maybe 2005, the number of U.S. attacks initially dropped in Pakistan. Then the U.S. began to use drones to target al-Qaeda individuals. So by the end of 2013, al-Qaeda is somewhat weak right now. Its leadership has been reduced. It has not been involved in many plots targeting the U.S. homeland. The last one was really in 2009, Najib al-Azazi, the plot in New York City that was foiled. But it's much weaker than it was on 2001. So I would say, to summarize, the U.S. has severely weakened al-Qaeda in Pakistan. We've seen the growth of al-Qaeda in other areas in North Africa and other parts of the Middle East. But here it's been weakened but not defeated.
Your book describes the challenges faced by Afghan government officials in establishing law and order, as well as undermining the corruption there. I mean, how much have these problems contributed to the rise of the Taliban?
Well, I think there's no question that the Afghan government's troubles in providing basic law and order, that is through its security services, and then governance, delivering services to the local population, its challenges in doing both of those things contributed to a vacuum.
It's a very weak government, isn't it?
Weak government in many areas. Where it's strongest tends to be in urban areas, the capital, Kabul, Kandahar city, Jalalabad, some of the key urban nodes.
Right.
But outside of those in rural areas, it's much weaker. And the Taliban was able to fill this vacuum in some cases with little or no security forces or people that were unhappy at the speed of service delivery.
Right, right. Well, I thought that was fascinating in your book to read about all these different warlords in the rural communities of Afghanistan, because they were providing the security for these rural areas.
Well, and this gets at one of the fundamental challenges in a country like Afghanistan, which is different from what, say, the U.S. faced in after World War II in Germany or Japan, yes, or even more recently in, say, the Balkans and Bosnia and Croatia. In Afghanistan, you have a central government whose control is limited. So when you get out to rural areas, the governance in those areas tends to be A, informal, and B, in the hands of tribal, sub-tribe, clan leaders, or
the strongest thug in the area, right?
Or power brokers. Well, in the case of tribal leaders, I mean, sometimes they're actually quite legitimate. But there are other power brokers who gain their power, control, and governance through intimidation.
Okay. Your book argues that Afghanistan has lacked a strong central government over the past centuries, in part because of the existence of tribes and clans and other sub-state actors. What lessons should the U.S. learn about operating in countries with weak governments, you think?
Well, I think there has to be a difference in strategies used between countries with a strong government, because in those countries you can focus pretty much all of your effort on building a state apparatus.
Okay.
The challenge you have with countries that have weak central governments is it can take a long time to build the state apparatus.
Yes.
And so you don't always have time to do that because you've got a war going on.
Right.
So part of the struggle is you do have to reach out to local, legitimate power brokers or tribal leaders. You can push efforts, development over the long run and build the state apparatus, but it will take time. So part of the lesson in these kinds of countries is you're going to have to deal with local power brokers, tribes, clans, and other entities.
So it's more involved in nation building then, right?
Well, I mean, there is a nation building component of it. How much you want to focus on it, obviously, is a key question.
Yes, it is. In February 2009, President Obama announced a nearly 50% increase in U.S. forces in Afghanistan and an additional 17,000 Marines and soldiers. Was this approved by Congress?
Well, really since the Korean War, the congressional role in U.S. troops has been that the president will get advice from members of Congress. Sometimes there'll be a vote. Okay. But the general practice has been, with some very minor exceptions, is Congress has often not voted on wars. So with an increase, because the war was going on, the president did have conversations with a number of members of Congress, both from the Republican and Democratic side, but they did not give him specific authority to do that.
Okay. And in your book's introduction, you write that the U.S. has spent $430 billion for military and diplomatic efforts over 5 years to defeat al-Qaeda beginning in 2001. George W. Bush pledged that we have begun a global war on terror, and it will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. And hasn't President Obama followed that policy path as well?
Well, in my view, that statement is probably unnecessary and gets the United States into situations that it would target groups that aren't targeting the United States.
Okay.
So I think in practice what President Bush did and what President Obama has largely done is focused on terrorist groups that are targeting the U.S. homeland. So yes, President Bush did focus on targeting groups in various areas in North Africa and East Africa, some areas in the Middle East, in the Philippines, against groups like Abu Sayyaf, as well as Al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations that were targeting the U.S. Obama has done something very similar. He's conducted a range of strikes and other efforts against groups from Somalia to Yemen to North Africa to Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Of course, all in an effort to protect the United States from any attack. Now, how did the George W. Bush administration's attack of Iraq prior to the invasion of Afghanistan affect world security?
Well, in my view, by 2002, as the U.S. began to plan the war effort in Iraq, there was no serious al-Qaeda presence in Iraq. So in my view, the war actually that started in 2003 in Iraq had two serious consequences. One is it pulled resources and attention away from the war in Afghanistan.
And you wrote that in your book.
I wrote that in the book. It pulled everything from forces to intelligence agents to platforms like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones away from the Afghan, Pakistan theater to Iraq. The second thing it did, in my view, is the large occupation of Iraq also radicalized a number of individuals and groups in the Muslim world. So it became identified as a, quote, crusader occupation of a Muslim country. And regardless of what anybody thinks about that, what it did do, we know categorically, is it increased the number of terrorists.
In 2001, how did the U.S. squander an extraordinary opportunity to overthrow the existing Afghan government and replace it with one favorable to the United States?
Well, in my view, one of the things that the U.S. did really well during that period is it overthrew the Taliban government in a matter, actually, of about 2 months, 2.5 months. It worked with a number of...
And what year was that?
2001.
2001, that's right, okay.
Yeah, and but what it began to do is turned quickly after that to pushing the Taliban aside. The Taliban went to Pakistan.
Okay.
And did not spend any efforts trying to pull the Taliban back into the government, because you asked about 2001. So didn't bring in any meaningful way the Taliban back into the governance apparatus. So they went from the government itself to an opposition and were never brought into the fold.
Oh, goodness. Your book has a lot of information about insurgencies. What is a good definition of an insurgency?
Well, in my view, an insurgency is an insurgent group is a group that attempts to either overthrow a current regime or secede from it, using both political and military tools to do it. So an insurgency is the prosecution of a war by a group that is either attempting to overthrow the group, like what we see in Afghanistan, or, as we saw in Chechnya, secede from it and create an independent state.
Yes, yes. And those definitions are in your book as well, which I want
That's right.
viewers to notice.
Yes.
And you wrote that by 2006, a full-bodied insurgency had developed in Afghanistan, and attacks increased by 400% from the prior 5 years, with the number of deaths increasing by 800%. What happened?
Well, by that time, the U.S. had started to pull out of key parts of the country. And in particular, the area that the Taliban has considered their strongest sanctuary in the south. The U.S. had handed probably the most important province over, Kandahar, to the Canadians. It handed Uruzgan over to the Dutch. It handed Helmand. These are all very important strategic provinces. Handed Helmand over to the British.
Now, these are members of NATO,
yes,
correct?
These are NATO members, but some of them, and the Canadians performed admirably well, but they had not been involved in a war, really, since 1950, major combat operations. So they were handing the war effort over to, a mixed group of NATO countries.
Exactly.
So that certainly contributed to it. But we also began to see the Afghan government itself was starting to have trouble. Corruption was going up. The drug trade was fueling concerns about the government. So the government was having trouble. The U.S. was handing over key portions to NATO. And then probably the third factor is we saw an increase in support to the Taliban
from
neighboring Pakistan.
Yes. Now, and in terms of the drugs, I wanted to talk about how is the export of poppy, a key ingredient of heroin, having an impact on Afghanistan's economy?
Well, actually, two things. One is the opium-based products that are cultivated, produced, and then shipped out of Afghanistan do actually have an important financial contribution, meaning farmers get paid for it, people tax the roads where they're moved along. I mean, it's obviously an illegal drug.
Yes.
And it's actually led to the second issue, which is very high levels of addiction within Afghanistan.
Ooh.
So by 2013, upwards of, according to some UN estimates, upwards of 6% of Afghans
are hooked,
are addicted, especially to heroin.
It was interesting to read that you spent time in Afghanistan conducting research on the security situation there. You wrote that in the early days of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, you could travel the country fairly easily by vehicle, but soon it became much more dangerous. How did you proceed to gather your facts in such a dangerous situation?
Well, I gathered my information on the state of the insurgency in three ways. One is I traveled to some very dangerous areas with the help of NATO forces, the Canadians in Kandahar, the British in Helmand Province, and then U.S. forces, especially in the east of Afghanistan. In a few cases, I just couldn't go to places. So
Right.
The second is I just didn't go. And the third is there were a few areas where I could travel with the United Nations or other non-governmental organizations who would bring me to some of these places. I'd usually have Kevlar on, and some number of people had weapons with me in case we got into a firefight somewhere.
Good.
But it, in a dangerous environment, you've got to take some chances, but you also have to be really careful.
Yes, you do. I'm glad you're here.
Me too.
Now let's get to the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, because how would you describe that relationship?
Well, the Afghan-Pakistan relationship is a complicated one. Pakistan, like all of Afghanistan's neighbors, wants, I think, a stable Afghanistan, but also wants one that is in its interests.
Okay.
And Pakistan's primary security interest has historically been protection from India. The two have fought 3 major wars and fought a lot of border skirmishes. And there was growing concern after the 2001 overthrow of the Taliban that the Karzai government in Afghanistan had become too close to the Indians. And so what it meant was Pakistan was strategically surrounded. Those are the words they often used. On one border it had India, the other border it had an Indian-Afghan axis. So what it meant is, as sort of an effort to gain strategic depth, the Pakistan government, especially its intelligence services, the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, began to reach out and support proxy organizations, especially the Taliban, who could at some point take the government, and it would have an ally, like they had with the Taliban government in the 1990s in Afghanistan.
Which has not been good for us, of
Which
course.
is not great for the United States, but in Pakistan's interest.
Absolutely. And then Pakistan had an important role when we were financially aiding the Afghan freedom fighters against the Soviet invaders. I mean, didn't we send CIA money to ISI in Pakistan to develop Stinger missiles for the Afghans to use against the Soviets? Briefly describe what happened.
Sure. During the 1980s, in the war against the Soviet Union, the U.S. supported the Mujahideen. So did the Pakistan government. So did the Saudis and a few others. What the U.S. did was, it was much more efficient to have the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency, actually coordinate the 7 major Afghan Mujahideen groups. So most, though not all, most CIA money, weapons, and other resources went through ISI to the 7 major groups who were headquartered in Pakistan, and they pushed it out to the field commanders in Afghanistan. That meant the Stinger missiles that Charlie Wilson was so important in pushing. Stinger missiles went from CIA to Pakistan to the Mujahideen, and then to shoot down Soviet helicopters in Afghanistan.
How much did the Pakistan government retain of all that equipment, do you think?
Well, there were CIA efforts, for example, to buy back a number of the Stinger missiles.
Yeah, I would think so.
By now, most of that stuff is not in particularly good shape, and the vast majority of stuff that was left, actually was used in the early 1990s, was the weapons and some of the other materials material that the CIA gave to Afghan groups. But by the way, it's important to note, because this issue comes up every once in a while, where some people have argued that the CIA and the U.S. more broadly supported bin Laden during that time period. I think it is important to know that there's no evidence that the CIA gave any. First of all, bin Laden was played such a minor, insignificant role in the effort against the Soviets.
Yes.
But there is no evidence that they ever received any money, any weapons, certainly no Stinger missiles.
That's good to hear. Well, news reports say many Afghans fear that the Afghan government fears that their government could collapse and the country could return to a civil war if we leave. You think that's possible? I think it's possible if the U.S. literally leaves and has no forces left in Afghanistan. I think there is a likelihood, assuming Pakistan continues to support the Taliban insurgency, Iran gives some limited support to the Taliban insurgency, that you will have an insurgency who's headquartered actually on the Pakistan side of the border, could continue to take ground in southern, eastern, potentially northern and western Afghanistan. So yes, I think it is a definite possibility. I've been reading reports about the Karzai government, and his cronies have gotten rich in the past decade, and they haven't built an Afghan government committed to delivering services and winning the loyalty of the Afghan people. I mean, what do you think of that Karzai government?
I think it depends. There have been some very effective cabinet officials, Minister of Finance, former Minister of Finance Ashraf Ghani, former World Bank senior official, I think has served in multiple capacities, very good technocrat, not corrupt in general. So there have been some aspects of the Karzai government that have been corrupt, been involved in corrupt practices, have not successfully looked out for the interests of Afghanistan. But I would also highlight that the Taliban has been just as probably more corrupt than the Afghan government. They're more heavily involved in the drug trade. They're more heavily involved in bribery and extortion. So you are talking about both sides of this. When you're giving large amounts of money, when there are drugs that are rebounding, both sides are involved. I want you to tell our viewers where they can find your book. Probably the easiest place they can find the book is on Amazon. If you just go to the Amazon site and type in the Graveyard of Empires, you'll come up with the book. You can also go to the www.norton
your publisher
site, the publisher, and you can find the book that way.
Now, do you have a website?
All of my information is available on the Rand Corporation website. That's www.rand.org. Okay, that's good to know. And how about the next book? Do you think you're going to be writing a new book? I finished one that came out in 2012 called Hunting in the Shadows, also published by Norton. The subtitle is The Pursuit of Al-Qaeda After 9/11, focuses on Al-Qaeda, and now I'm starting to work on a most recent one. Very good, very good. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.